On the morning of April 18, 1906, nearly $300 million in gold and silver sat inside the San Francisco Mint. Outside, broken water mains left firefighters with dry hoses, and within 3 days, 225,000 people, more than half the city, had no home. The Mint survived. 28,000 buildings did not. Gold brought the fortune. Fire exposed who controlled the land, the credit, and the rebuilding. Before San Francisco had streets along its eastern shore, the tide covered them. When the water withdrew from Yerba Buena Cove, it exposed a broad margin of mud and shallow pools. The ground was firm enough for a surveyor's ink, but not for a warehouse wall. Montgomery Street would eventually run near the old shoreline. 4 blocks of commercial land would later stand between that street and the bay. In the beginning, most of it was water. The land around the Golden Gate was, and remains, the traditional territory of the Yelamu, a local tribe of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. Their presence reached back thousands of years before a European government placed a fort above the entrance to the bay. In 1776, Spain established the Presidio to guard that entrance and protect the nearby Mission San Francisco de Asís. The first large transfer of power here was not commercial. It was military, religious, and territorial. When Mexico gained independence from Spain, the Presidio became a Mexican outpost. Flags changed over the fort, but the physical advantage beneath them did not. A narrow strait opened into hundreds of square miles of protected water. Ships could enter from the Pacific and anchor inside a bay sheltered from the open ocean. Yerba Buena Cove offered protection, but little convenience. Its water was shallow near shore. Cargo often had to cross the space between ship and land in smaller boats. At low tide, the distance became mud. It was an excellent place to arrive and a poor place to unload. That distinction would eventually make fortunes. By the early 1840s, Yerba Buena was still a small collection of adobe houses, wooden buildings, stores, and waterfront structures. Its commerce moved through hides, tallow, and imported goods. Cattle raised on California ranches supplied thick hides and rendered fat. Ships carried those products away and returned with manufactured articles that local households could not easily produce. William Alexander Ladysdorff understood the value of that exchange. He operated vessels, built a commercial warehouse near the water, and helped give the settlement the machinery of a port. The warehouse was plain evidence of what the cove could do. Goods entered by water, stopped briefly behind wooden walls, then moved inland at a higher price. No gold was required. Then, on July 31, 1846, the Brooklyn entered the bay after a voyage from New York around Cape Horn. On board were roughly 240 Mormon passengers, including about 100 children. They had spent nearly 6 months at sea. When they came ashore with their baggage, tools, and printing equipment, their number nearly doubled the population of Yerba Buena. A modern city could absorb 240 people into a few apartment buildings. Yerba Buena had to absorb them into almost everything it possessed. The new arrivals became farmers, carpenters, shopkeepers, and printers. They added labor to a place that needed nearly every useful trade. Among them was Samuel Brannan, who would establish the California Star, the settlement's first newspaper. For the moment, his printing press served a town of only a few hundred people. The machine had arrived before the audience that would make it powerful. The Brooklyn also arrived during a transfer of sovereignty. Earlier that month, United States forces had raised their flag over the plaza as war continued with Mexico. California would not be formally ceded to the United States until 1848, but local government, land administration, and commercial expectations had already begun to change. On January 30th, 1847, the town ceased to be called Yerba Buena. It became San Francisco. The name suggested a city long before the physical evidence did. There were still only a few hundred inhabitants, few substantial buildings, and no direct overland connection to the rest of the United States. Yet the new name joined the settlement to the bay marked on international charts. It made the town and the harbor easier to imagine as one commercial place. Surveyor Jasper O'Farrell gave that imagination lines. His 1847 plan extended the existing grid and laid out Market Street on a broad diagonal. On paper, rectangular blocks met hills, sand, and tidal ground without hesitation. A map did not need to haul stone up a slope or drive timber into mud. It could divide difficult ground as easily as level ground, then give each division a boundary and a potential owner. The physical town remained small. The legal town was already growing beyond it. That was San Francisco's advantage before the gold rush. It possessed no mine, but it stood between the Pacific Ocean and California's interior. A person entering by sea could pass through it. So could a barrel of flour, an iron stove, a shovel, a letter, or a loan. The shallow cove was an inconvenience only while demand remained small. With enough people arriving, the inconvenience itself could become valuable. Wharves could charge for access. Warehouses could charge for space. Mud could be enclosed, filled, and sold. But in January 1848, there was not yet enough traffic to justify such work. San Francisco was still a harbor waiting for a cargo large enough to remake it. That cargo began about 130 miles to the northeast, at a sawmill under construction near the American River. On January 24th, carpenter James Marshall inspected the water running through the mill's tail race. Something metallic caught the light among the wet stones. He examined the flakes, uncertain at first what they were. Then he gathered them from the water, folded them into a piece of cloth, and carried them toward John Sutter. In May 1848, a small bottle crossed San Francisco Bay, carrying enough gold dust to empty a town. The bottle belonged to Samuel Brannan. Behind him, near the American River, men were already bending over pans and scraping gravel. Ahead of him, San Francisco's stores still held picks, shovels, flour, boots, and iron cookware. The shelves had not changed. The information inside the bottle was about to change the price of everything on them. James Marshall and John Sutter had tried to prevent exactly this. After Marshall carried the flakes from the sawmill tail race to Sutter, the two men tested the metal and satisfied themselves that it was gold. Their first response was not celebration. Sutter had spent years assembling a private domain of farmland, livestock, workshops, and labor. Marshall was trying to finish a sawmill. Gold offered wealth in the ground, but it threatened the workers required to operate everything above it. They asked for secrecy. It was an impossible request. The gold lay in moving water where laborers could see it. Men working at the mill began testing the gravel for themselves. A piece of information that could be carried in a pocket traveled from one worker to another, then downstream toward Sutter's fort. The more Sutter tried to protect his enterprise, the more valuable confirmed knowledge became. Samuel Brannan stood where that knowledge met a market. He was not merely a newspaper publisher. He was a Mormon elder, a community organizer, and a merchant. He had arrived aboard the Brooklyn in 1846 with a printing press and had established the California Star in San Francisco. By 1847, he also operated a store at Sutter's Fort, close enough to the American River to supply workers and settlers. Brannan therefore occupied three useful positions. People listened to him as a leader. He could reproduce information as a publisher. And when those people acted on that information, he could sell them what they needed. Once reports of the discovery reached him, Brannan went to the mining area and obtained gold he could show with his own hands. He returned to San Francisco with the metal in a bottle. Later accounts preserve his cry as he moved through the streets. Gold! Gold from the American River! The exact wording comes through recollection. The result is easier to measure. San Francisco began to empty. Carpenters put down their saws. Clerks left counters unattended. Sailors walked away from ships. Public officials, laborers, mechanics, and shopkeepers joined the movement inland. Within roughly 7 months, about 3/4 of the town's male residents had gone toward the diggings. The migration did not look like a parade. It looked like unfinished work. Cargo waited on decks because there were too few hands to unload it. Houses stood half-built. Businesses shortened their hours or closed. Even the newspapers suffered. The Californian stopped printing when its staff departed. On June 14, the California Star also suspended publication because the people needed to produce it had gone looking for the mineral its owner had helped publicize. Brannan's press fell silent. His stores did not. Every person leaving San Francisco needed some combination of food, clothing, blankets, tools, and transportation. I might believe that a pan and a few days of labor stood between him and a fortune. The pan still had to be purchased before he reached the river. Brannan did not need to know which miner would succeed. He earned money from the attempt. In the 3 months after his announcement, receipts at his store reportedly reached about $36,000. At its busiest, the business sold as much as $5,000 in goods in a single day. That figure did not sit in a distant mine. It crossed a wooden counter in sacks of gold dust, coins, and promises of payment, exchanged for ordinary objects that had become scarce at precisely the right moment. Brannan opened additional stores closer to the mining traffic. He invested his profits in land and other businesses. He also persuaded some Mormon miners to pay him a portion of what they recovered, while he pursued a claim to legal title over the gold fields. The title was never secured. The payments had already been made. Nothing in this arrangement required Brannan to find gold himself. His advantage was steadier. A miner had to choose the right stream, work the right patch of gravel, and arrive before someone else. A merchant needed the miner to remain hopeful long enough to buy supplies. James Marshall possessed the opposite advantage. He had been first at the tail race, but being first gave him no enforceable ownership over the gold moving through the water. As newcomers crowded into the region, the sawmill project lost workers and its surrounding claims became difficult to control. Marshall's discovery outgrew him. He never accumulated the fortune attached to his name. John Sutter fared little better. The mineral beneath California drew labor away from his fields and workshops, invited strangers across his land, and weakened the private settlement he had tried to preserve. Gold increased the value of the territory while damaging the enterprises already standing on it. Brannan, meanwhile, became widely described as California's first millionaire. The contrast required no hidden theft and no complicated machine. Marshall found the metal. Sutter tried to hide it. Brannan carried proof to the market and sold equipment to the people who believed the proof. For several months, however, the excitement remained largely Pacific in scale. News traveled quickly to Oregon, Hawaii, Mexico, Chile, and Peru because vessels already connected those places to the California coast. Reports reaching the eastern United States sounded less dependable. Newspapers printed letters about extraordinary discoveries, but distant editors had heard extravagant Western claims before. Then the federal government placed its authority behind the rumor. On December 5, 1848, President James K. Polk informed Congress that official reports confirmed California's gold deposits. The accounts, he acknowledged, were extraordinary. They were also supported by officers in public service. Gold from an unfinished sawmill was now part of a presidential message. The bottle Brannan had carried through San Francisco was no longer necessary. The United States government had become the publisher. Men in eastern ports bought passage south around Cape Horn or toward the crossing at Panama. Merchants ordered cargo for customers they had never met. Shipowners filled cabins, holds, and any other space that could carry a paying passenger. Then, beyond the narrow opening of the Golden Gate, the first sails of 1849 appeared. By 1851, more than 800 ships filled Yerba Buena Cove. Their masts rose so thickly against the hills that observers called them a forest. Rigging struck wood in the wind. Hulls shifted with the tide, but on many decks no sailors answered. The vessels had crossed oceans to reach San Francisco and then stopped, abandoned within sight of the streets they had helped overwhelm. The first great movement came from the eastern United States, where passengers chose between sailing around Cape Horn or crossing the fever-ridden Isthmus of Panama and waiting for another ship on the Pacific side. Others arrived from Mexico, Chile, and Peru, where the news had traveled months earlier by coastal shipping. More followed from Europe, Australia, and China. Their languages differed. Their expectations did not. Most entered San Francisco, believing the city was only a doorway. Gold lay inland, beyond the bay, the rivers, and the rising foothills. But every passenger needed to step through that doorway. Their trunks, blankets, and tools came through it. So did the flour they ate, the boots they wore, and the lumber required to build a roof over them. San Francisco did not need to contain the gold. It only needed to stand between the gold and nearly everything the miners required. The ships brought the first wave of material. Their holds carried prefabricated houses, iron stoves, barrels, clothing, tools, liquor, and food. Once the cargo had been unloaded, however, many captains faced an unexpected problem. Their crews had been listening to the same stories as their passengers. Sailors deserted. A ship might arrive with enough men to handle canvas, climb rigging, and work the capstan. Within days, it could be unable to leave its anchorage. Wages rose, but the possibility of finding gold rose faster in the imagination. Captains watched trained seamen disappear toward Sacramento, leaving expensive vessels to swing unattended in shallow water. The Niantic entered this market almost by accident. Built in 1832 for the China trade, she had carried tea, porcelain, and silk from Asian ports to New York. She was later converted into a whaling ship. In 1849, while she was at Peru, her owners ordered her to suspend whaling and sail to Panama, where thousands of gold seekers were stranded after crossing the isthmus. Captain Henry Cleveland removed the whaling equipment and advertised passage to San Francisco. 249 people signed on. Most paid $150 for a bunk in the hold. Those able to afford a cabin paid $250. The Niantic sailed from Panama in May and entered San Francisco Bay on July 5, 1849. Her passengers left. Most of the crew followed. After the remaining sailors caused trouble, Cleveland discharged the last 5 men on July 11. A ship designed to cross oceans had been brought to a stop by a river more than 100 miles away. With no practical crew and little hope of hiring another, the Niantic became more valuable as real estate than as transportation. Investors Samuel Ward and Adolphe Maillard purchased her, hauled her toward the shoreline, and stripped away material that could be used elsewhere. The remaining hull became a store, warehouse, and hotel. Goods that had once crossed the sea inside the Niantic now waited inside her without moving. People slept in cabins built to carry passengers thousands of miles, though the ship itself would never travel another foot. The same conversion occurred across the waterfront. One vessel became the town jail. Others became storeships, lodging houses, saloons, and warehouses. Nearly 100 ships were permanently moored or incorporated into the growing shore. Some were dismantled for timber. Others were deliberately sunk or left where mud and construction would close around them. San Francisco was not building beside the ships. It was building between them. On land, canvas tents and lightly framed wooden structures filled the available blocks. A roof could be raised quickly, occupied immediately, and replaced when something more profitable became possible. The same urgency made the city dense. Stores pressed against lodging houses. Cooking fires, lamps, and stoves operated within walls assembled from dry boards. The shortage extended beyond buildings. Yerba Buena Cove was still shallow near its original shore, and too few wharves reached water deep enough for large vessels. Cargo had to move across boats, gangways, and mud before it reached a customer. Every delay increased the value of storage close to the landing, so businessmen extended piers into the bay, some reaching roughly 1,000 feet toward deeper water. Between those piers, workers dumped sand, mud, stone, and debris. Wrecked ships supplied both obstacles and foundations. If a shallow parcel could be enclosed and filled, water could become usable ground. The process did more than enlarge the city. It altered the meaning of the shoreline. Montgomery Street had once stood at the edge of the cove. As the filling advanced, new streets appeared to its east. Battery, Sansome, Davis, and Front would eventually occupy land where boats had floated. The map remained rectangular. The bay was made to retreat from it. The Niantic showed how quickly this could happen. When she arrived in 1849, she anchored in Yerba Buena Cove. By 1850, the stranded hull stood more than 3 blocks from the open water, though it had never been moved that distance across dry land. The city had formed around it. San Francisco's population was nearly as difficult to locate as its old shoreline. The federal census returns for 1850 were later destroyed by fire, leaving no complete official count for that year. The California State Census of 1852 recorded 34,776 people. Only 6 years earlier, the arrival of fewer than 240 passengers aboard the Brooklyn had nearly doubled the settlement. Now a single census required counting a population large enough to fill more than 140 ships of the Brooklyn's size. The port had solved its shortage of ground by manufacturing ground. Ships delivered people, lost their crews, became buildings, and disappeared beneath streets. Mud received stone. Water lots received walls. Each new foot of land gave merchants another place to store what the next arriving ship carried. But the speed of construction had produced another shortage. San Francisco had warehouses, tents, hotels, and crowded wooden blocks. It did not yet have a dependable system for keeping them from burning together. On Christmas Eve, 1849, flames broke through the roof of Dennison's Exchange on Kearny Street before a bucket brigade could form. The wind caught the fire and carried it into the neighboring buildings. The bucket line formed beneath a burning roof. Men passed water hand to hand while sparks moved above them. San Francisco's streets were narrow, its buildings crowded, and its walls made largely of wood. Canvas hung beside pine boards. Cooking stoves, oil lamps, and stores of liquor occupied structures raised in days. Wind from the bay supplied what the flames needed next. On Christmas Eve, 1849, fire broke through the roof of Dennison's Exchange on Kearny Street before the bucket brigade was ready. It spread into the neighboring buildings and did not stop until 50 of them were gone. The estimated loss reached $1.5 million. The money had purchased lumber, merchandise, furniture, and claims to commercial space. By morning, much of that value could be lifted with a shovel. The town responded quickly. Citizens met on Christmas night to organize fire companies. 3 hand-pumped engines that had traveled around Cape Horn became the center of a volunteer department. 90 men served in the first engine companies, with 40 more assigned to hooks and ladders. They had equipment. They still needed water. On May 4, 1850, the second Great Fire started in a saloon built on the same site as the first. It swept through the block bounded by Kearny, Clay, Montgomery, and Washington streets, then jumped across Kearny. Residents tore down houses by hand to prevent the fire from climbing farther uphill. Where walls were too strong, buildings were pulled apart or blown up. The fire stopped when it reached ground from which the buildings had been removed, or when it had consumed what remained. 300 structures were lost. 1 man and 2 children died. The estimated damage reached $4 million. Yet the ground beneath the ruins remained some of the most expensive commercial space in the city. The following day, a hotel was already operating beneath a tent on its burned site. That was the pattern. Fire removed buildings. Demand kept the land occupied. The city ordered a 12,000-gallon cistern beneath Portsmouth Square. Artesian wells were dug. An ordinance instructed each household to keep 6 water buckets ready, but engines, pumps, and buckets could not produce water that was not nearby. San Francisco would not install hydrants until 1858. A third great fire arrived on June 14, 1850, little more than a month after the second. Another 300 buildings disappeared between the hills and the bay. The loss was placed at $5 million. In less than 6 months, the first 3 fires had consumed property valued at more than $10 million. The city rebuilt again. Some owners chose heavier walls and better doors. Others faced a simpler calculation. Brick cost more than wood. Iron shutters took time to import. A lightly framed building could begin collecting rent, while a safer building was still waiting for material to arrive by ship. The result was not a uniform improvement. It was a patchwork. A brick warehouse might stand beside a wooden lodging house, which stood beside a canvas-covered shop. The fire-resistant building protected its contents until the structure next door delivered enough heat. The fourth great fire, in September 1850, destroyed more than 100 buildings. Fire companies fought it without sufficient water. By then, the city was not suffering from a single defective neighborhood or an unlucky season. Its real estate market was producing buildings faster than its public systems could protect them. The most destructive test came during the night of May 3 and the morning of May 4, 1851. A high wind drove the flames into the business district. Heavy wooden sidewalks helped carry the fire. The hollow spaces beneath the planks drew air and directed heat along the streets, functioning less like pavement than long wooden ducts. Fire could pass beneath a man's feet and emerge in the next block. Hand pumps had to be dragged through crowded streets by the same men who then worked their handles. A 50-foot length of riveted buffalo hide hose weighed about 60 pounds before its couplings were added. Firefighters could exhaust themselves merely delivering the equipment to the flames. In less than 10 hours, more than 18 blocks were left smoldering. Contemporary estimates placed the loss above $12 million. Newspapers and residents blamed incendiaries, as they did after several fires of the period. The suspicion was real. Proof for every accusation was not. The fire reached the manufactured waterfront. The Niantic had already ceased to look much like a ship. Streets and buildings surrounded her stranded hull. During the May fire, the structure above the waterline burned. The lowest timbers, protected by mud and fill, remained. They were useful. A hotel was constructed on the surviving bottom, carrying the Niantic name. The same object had crossed the Pacific, housed passengers, stored merchandise, and then served as a foundation beneath rooms that charged rent. Fire ended one use and exposed the next. 6 weeks later, on June 22nd, the sixth great fire struck the portion of the city that earlier flames had spared. It traveled southeast from Pacific Street, destroying the district between Powell and Sansom, from Clay to Broadway. Losses were estimated above $3 million. 6 major fires had crossed San Francisco in 18 months. Depending on the blaze, a quarter to half of the existing town could be damaged or destroyed. Yet the effect was not to leave the city empty. It was to make rebuilding capital increasingly decisive. In the central business district, new buildings appeared with brick walls 2 or 3 feet thick, double shutters, and iron doors. Merchants who had suffered repeated losses could justify the cost if they still possessed land, credit, or outside investors. On the edges of the city, wooden construction continued. Safety became another material that some owners could purchase sooner than others. Property required more than walls. It required order, contracts, and enforcement. In June 1851, merchants and other citizens formed the Committee of Vigilance, claiming that ordinary government could not control robbery, violence, and disorder. The committee arrested suspects, conducted its own proceedings, and carried out 4 executions before disbanding 3 months later. The same commercial class that built private warehouses and volunteer fire companies had now assembled a private system of judgment. Meanwhile, the city itself owed money. Among its creditors was Dr. Peter Smith, who had treated indigent patients on the city's behalf. His hospital had burned in October 1850, but his claims for payment survived. San Francisco had issued promises instead of sufficient cash, and Smith intended to collect. After the flames, he carried those papers into court. A wooden stake rose from the water near San Francisco's southern waterfront. On shore, a map gave the surrounding mud a block number, straight boundaries, and an owner waiting to happen. A buyer could not build on the lot without driving piles or bringing in fill. At high tide, he might need a boat merely to inspect it. Yet the auctioneer could sell it as real estate because the lines on the map existed even when the ground inside them did not. San Francisco had discovered a way to use its future shoreline to pay its present debts. Dr. Peter Smith was one of the people waiting to be paid. In 1850, the city contracted with him to care for indigent patients at $4 per patient each day. San Francisco lacked enough coin, so it compensated him with city scrip, a paper promise bearing interest at 3% a month. The patients required food, beds, medicine, and attendance in the present. The city offered payment from the future. Smith's hospital burned in October 1850. Nearly 150 patients were removed, but the building and much of its contents were lost. Smith's claims against San Francisco continued to accumulate. In 1851, he demanded coin instead of more paper and obtained an initial judgment for $19,238. His total claims would eventually exceed $64,000. The city still did not have the cash. What it possessed was property, including surveyed rectangles extending beyond the high water line. California had transferred control of many tidelands to San Francisco under conditions that left the state with its own financial interest and future rights. The arrangement was sufficient to permit sales and uncertain enough to produce years of litigation. Smith used a creditor's right to force the sale of his debtor's property. On June 14, 1851, Sheriff Jack Hayes offered 103 water lots, 7 blocks of beachfront property, and 7 other city parcels. The bidders gathered only weeks after the largest fire in San Francisco's history. Ash remained in the business district. The city needed money. The auction contained some of the waterfront it would need for future streets and commerce. Then San Francisco warned buyers not to trust the sale. On the same day as the auction, the Commission for the Funded Debt published a notice stating that the city had no legal title to the lots and that a sheriff's sale would convey none. It was an unusual method of raising money. The seller advertised the property and disputed its own ability to sell it. The warning kept cautious buyers away. Low attendance kept bids low. Speculators willing to accept clouded title obtained waterfront parcels for a fraction of what supporters believed they would eventually be worth. The first sale did not raise enough to satisfy Smith. More auctions followed. The city's warning had reduced the price, and the reduced price made additional sales necessary. Some officials were not merely watching. State Senator David Broderick helped shape legislation authorizing water lot transactions and purchased some of the lots himself. Newspapers argued over whether the city's leaders had deliberately depressed prices for favored buyers or had simply mismanaged a public debt. The result was the same on the map. More rectangles acquired private names. H.B. Tichenor bought one of the clearest examples. At Steamboat Point, where shallow water dropped quickly toward a deeper channel, Tikhonor established a marine railway for hauling vessels out of the bay. In June 1851, he paid approximately $2,700 for the adjoining water lot. The purchase did not give him solid earth. It gave him the right to create useful ground beside a useful stretch of water. He built the railway, repaired ships, and made the location part of the working harbor. By 1868, Central Pacific Railroad paid approximately $250,000 for the same point. The original price could have been arranged in a stack of gold coins on a small table. The later price required corporate capital. Between those transactions, the property had changed physically. Access, wharves, industry, and transportation made the lot worth more. Speculation anticipated that change, but construction helped produce it. The process spread along the waterfront. Owners drove wooden pilings into mud, suspended warehouses above the tide, and filled the spaces between wharves. Sand hills that obstructed streets became a convenient source of earth. Beginning in 1852, a steam-powered shovel worked day and night, loading sand into open cars. Small locomotives carried it over temporary tracks and dumped it into Yerba Buena Cove. A hill could lose height while a water lot acquired it. Fill made the lots easier to occupy. Occupation made them easier to mortgage and resell. Each warehouse, track, and street strengthened the claim that the rectangles on the old map were no longer imaginary. The legal position remained tangled. The California Supreme Court upheld titles arising from the Peter Smith sales, encouraging another rush of investment. Later federal decisions unsettled parts of that result. City and state rights overlapped. Some parcels had been offered more than once. Buyers traded not only land, but competing expectations of which document a future court would honor. Possession still had its own force. A lot enclosed by a fence, covered with fill and carrying a warehouse, looked more permanent than a line beneath the tide. The flexibility of this property system had limits, and they did not fall equally. Beginning in 1852, California imposed a special tax on foreign miners that was enforced primarily against Chinese workers. The payment removed money from each month's labor before a miner could accumulate capital of his own. Then, in 1854, the California Supreme Court decided People v. Hall. A white defendant's murder conviction was reversed because Chinese witnesses had testified against him. The court ruled that Chinese people could not provide evidence for or against a white person. In one set of cases, courts considered whether a man could own a rectangle beneath San Francisco Bay. In another, they decided whether a witness standing inside the courtroom could legally be heard. By the middle of the decade, the city had turned portions of its shallow harbor into transferable property. Wharves reached deeper water. Warehouses stood on pilings and buried hulls. Paper titles could be sold, challenged, upheld, and used as security for another loan. But a larger commercial city required more than individual speculators carrying gold dust between counters. It needed coins of dependable weight, banks capable of holding deposits, and lenders able to finance projects larger than a single merchant. Across San Francisco, raw gold still moved in leather pouches and was measured on small balance scales. Soon it would pass through a locked stone building and fall from a press bearing the same letter on every coin. A leather pouch was opened above a balance scale in San Francisco. What fell from it was not yet money. It was dust, flakes, and small pieces of gold, mixed with the uncertainty of every creek bed from which they had been taken. The metal had to be weighed, tested, refined, rolled into blanks, and struck between steel dies. When it emerged, every piece carried a fixed value and the same small letter. The San Francisco Mint opened on April 3, 1854. During its first year, it produced $4,084,207 in gold coins. That figure represented more than metal. It was thousands of private discoveries converted into objects that strangers could exchange without inspecting each other's scales. Before the mint, California commerce had operated through gold dust, private coins, foreign currency, and barter. A merchant accepting dust had to judge its purity. A miner paying for a meal might watch part of his fortune disappear into the merchant's weighing pan. Every transaction required a small argument about what the metal was worth. Coinage removed much of that friction. Gold entering the mint as irregular matter left with standardized weight, edges, and markings. San Francisco was no longer merely the place where mining supplies were unloaded. It had acquired the machinery that decided what the product of the mines would look like when it entered circulation. Then the useful metal began arriving from somewhere else. In 1859, miners east of the Sierra Nevada found that the dark rock and bluish mud interfering with their gold recovery contained silver in extraordinary quantities. Material once discarded beside the workings now demanded its own shafts, mills, and assays. The Comstock lode did not resemble the shallow California streams where a man could work with a pan, a shovel, and persistence. Its ore descended into fractured ground. Following it required timber arranged in interlocking square sets to prevent the rock from closing over the miners. It required pumps to lift hot water from deep workings, steam engines to drive machinery, and mills capable of crushing stone by the ton. A miner could discover a vein with his own hands. He could not easily finance the underground structure required to keep reaching it. The distance between San Francisco and the Comstock was measured in mountain roads. Financially, it could be crossed by a signature. The Bank of California was founded in 1864 by a group that included William Chapman Ralston, with Darius Ogden Mills serving as its first president. In Virginia City, William Sharon directed the bank's interests close to the mines. Together with allied investors, they became known as the bank crowd. Their capital paid for pumps, timber, mills, and deeper shafts. It allowed mining companies to continue operating through the long interval between spending money underground and recovering saleable ore. Credit made deeper mining possible. It also placed the mines themselves within reach of the lender. When borrowers failed to repay, the bank crowd could foreclose. According to the historical record preserved by Nevada State Parks, the group at one point controlled nearly all the mines of the Comstock through loans followed by foreclosure. The bank did not swing a pick. The loan contract performed that part of the excavation. This arrangement did not merely extract ownership. The capital also purchased machinery that individual miners could not afford and kept costly workings open. Those two facts occupied the same ledger. Deeper shafts produced more ore, and the institutions financing them gained greater control over what lay below. The silver remained in Nevada until it was removed from the rock. Much of the financial command over it sat in San Francisco offices, behind counters where ink dried beside columns of figures. Ralston carried the method beyond mining. Bank money and affiliated capital moved into railroads, factories, water projects, real estate, and the enormous Palace Hotel rising near Market Street. The city was being equipped through overlapping networks of credit and ownership. A bank that had financed pumps beneath Virginia City could also help determine where tracks, pipes, workshops, and hotel walls appeared in San Francisco. The movement of metal required a larger building. In November 1874, a new United States Mint opened at 5th and Mission Streets. It resembled a stone temple with a high entrance stair, columns, heavy walls, and a central courtyard. Its granite and concrete foundation extended 5 feet into the ground, deep enough to discourage anyone attempting to tunnel toward the vaults. Inside the courtyard stood a well. Construction, furnishings, and machinery cost $2,201,198.32. The final 32 cents belonged to the same world as the 5-foot foundation, value measured precisely. then protected with stone. The building suggested permanence. The financial system around it remained dependent on something less solid. In August 1875, the Bank of California closed its doors. Mining losses, speculative commitments, and a sudden collapse of confidence had created demands the bank could not meet. Depositors did not need to understand every investment attached to Ralston's network. They needed only to believe that other depositors would reach the counter first. Ralston surrendered his control and transferred property to the bank. On August 27, he went for his customary swim from North Beach. His body was recovered from the bay. Some contemporaries believed he had killed himself. Others attributed his death to a stroke while swimming. The evidence never settled the question. The bank reopened after new capital was assembled under Mills. Ralston was gone, but the institution survived. So did the method. Gather deposits, extend credit, take collateral, and direct enterprises whose machinery might stand hundreds of miles from the desk where the loan was approved. San Francisco had learned to profit from a mine without containing the mine. Its next source of leverage would lie even closer. Gas lines, water pipes, telephone wires, and street railways all required capital, but they also required permission. Soon, one of the most valuable pieces of paper in the city would be the right to place 2 steel rails down the middle of a public street. Beneath Market Street, a steel cable moved through a narrow channel in a continuous loop. A gripman lowered an iron grip through the slot between the rails, caught the moving cable, and pulled his car into the traffic. Above the pavement, the street belonged to the public. Below it, private machinery collected a nickel whenever someone needed to cross the city. Railroads had already altered San Francisco on a larger scale. When the transcontinental line was completed in 1869, the city gained a direct connection to eastern factories, banks, and customers. On the Central Pacific alone, more than 10,000 Chinese laborers had blasted tunnels through the Sierra Nevada, built road beds across exposed ground, and laid hundreds of miles of track. The finished railroad carried passengers and merchandise into California. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 barred additional Chinese laborers from entering the United States. The country kept the rails and closed the gate behind many of the men who had built them. Within San Francisco, transportation determined which land could become valuable. The waterfront was no longer the only center of movement. Houses climbed the hills and spread westward, but distance and grade separated them from offices, warehouses, and shops. Cable cars reduced that separation. First demonstrated in San Francisco in 1873, the system used underground machinery derived from mining equipment. Instead of hauling ore through a shaft, moving wire rope pulled passenger cars over the city's slopes. Gas pipes, electric lines, telephone wires, and street railways followed the same economic pattern. Each extended the useful city. Each changed the price of the property beside it. None could operate through public streets without permission. A franchise was not a rail, a pole, or a power station. It was an ordinance granting a company the right to place those things on land owned by the public. Once granted, it could become more valuable than the machinery it authorized. A strip of cobbles remained municipal property, but the right to carry every passenger along it could belong to one corporation for years. That made a vote on the Board of Supervisors a financial instrument. With enough votes, a company could acquire access to a route that its customers could not easily avoid. Abraham Rueff understood the point of connection. A lawyer and political organizer, he built a disciplined political machine that helped place Eugene Schmitz in the mayor's office in 1902 and elect supervisors loyal to the organization. Rueff did not need to occupy the mayor's chair. He could stand between the company seeking a privilege and the officials whose votes could supply it. That position became especially useful to the United Railroads of San Francisco. Formed in 1902 from a collection of existing street railway companies, United Railroads inherited cable lines, electric streetcars, power stations, and franchises spread across the city. Cable operation was profitable, but expensive. Long-moving cables required engine houses, underground channels, pulleys, and constant maintenance. An electric streetcar drawing power from an overhead wire could be operated more cheaply. The physical difference was easy to see. Cable power remained beneath the pavement. Electric power hung above it from poles and cross wires. The financial difference was contained in the franchise. Many San Franciscans objected to giving United Railroads a more economical system without demanding something in return. Negotiations beginning in 1905 considered whether electricity should be carried through underground conduits on major streets and whether part of the savings should return to the city. United Railroads wanted overhead wires and offered no reduced fare. The nickel would remain a nickel even if moving the car cost less. The company retained Roof as an attorney. It then ended negotiations with the Citizens Committee and prepared to deal directly with the supervisors. What followed would be reconstructed through confessions, testimony, bank records, and criminal trials. The earthquake and fire of April 1906 halted the cable cars and damaged the city. Within weeks, the supervisors allowed United Railroads to string overhead trolley wires along Market Street. The first permission was described as temporary. The wires were not. Later testimony described cash promised to supervisors in exchange for their votes. Investigators traced $200,000 sent to San Francisco and converted from gold into small bills at the United States Mint, where currency intended for earthquake relief made the transaction easier to handle. The same building that standardized mining wealth now helped turn a large corporate sum into paper that could pass from hand to hand. The investigation widened beyond streetcars. Telephone franchises, gas rates, prize-fighting permits, and other municipal privileges had all passed through the same narrow political channel. Rueff eventually confessed to participating in bribery arrangements. Schmitz was convicted in a related extortion case, although that conviction was later overturned. Most of the corporate defendants escaped lasting punishment. The prosecution itself became another contested piece of city machinery. On November 13, 1908, Francis Heney was prosecuting Rueff when Morris Haas, a former prospective juror whom Heney had exposed in court, approached during a recess and shot him in the face. Heney survived. The trial continued, and Rueff was convicted. By then, the overhead wires were already carrying electricity above Market Street. A courtroom could punish a man. It could not easily remove an operating transportation system on which the rebuilt city now depended. To reach the moment when those wires became possible, the story must return to the morning before the franchises, testimony, and gunshot. At almost precisely 5:12 on April 18, 1906, a foreshock moved through San Francisco. Roughly 20 seconds later, the main rupture began. The shaking lasted less than a minute, but pavement buckled, buildings dropped masonry into the streets, and gas and water mains twisted apart underground. The cable beneath Market Street stopped moving. Fire crews opened hydrants as smoke began rising near the business district. The valves turned, but the broken mains supplied little water. A length of canvas hose lay flat in the street. Inside the building, later known as the Old Mint, the stone floor moved beneath the night shift. Furniture overturned, chimneys cracked, and the gas works failed. The heavy walls remained intact. At the center of the building, surrounded by granite stairs, iron railings, and locked rooms, an artesian well opened into the courtyard. Its dark surface survived the shaking without knowing what had broken outside. Water mains had split beneath San Francisco. Gas escaped from ruptured pipes, and fires appeared in dozens of places. The cable system stopped. Streets filled with fallen brick, broken glass, household bundles, and people moving toward ferries, parks, and any open ground. Fire engines crossed the debris, but many hydrants produced little or nothing. Firefighters, soldiers, and property owners tried to replace water with demolition. Dynamite was used to remove buildings ahead of the flames, creating gaps the fire might not cross. Some charges were placed badly or used by men with little experience. Walls fell, windows shattered, and fresh wreckage joined the fuel already lying in the streets. Explosions near the Mint later destroyed plate glass that had survived both earthquake and fire. The fires burned for 3 days. More than 28,000 buildings disappeared. Most of them wooden structures that had represented rent, collateral, inventory, and shelter only hours earlier. Roughly 225,000 residents of a city of about 400,000 were left without homes. Parks became fields of canvas. Cooking pots stood beside mattresses and trunks. Modern estimates place the dead above 3,000, including people whose names never entered the early official counts. At the Mint, the first defense was iron. Workers closed the heavy shutters over the lower windows and cleared flammable material from the walls. The building had its own water, but the earthquake had damaged the steam pump needed to move it. Before the pump could be repaired, the men used barrels of acids kept for coin production against small fires approaching the building. About an hour after the earthquake, the pump began working. By then, day shift employees and 10 soldiers had joined the men inside, bringing the number of defenders to around 60. Plumbers had completed an internal fire hose system only 10 days earlier. 70 feet of 1-inch hose now carried water from the courtyard well to the roof, windows, and wooden frames where the heat could enter. The fire arrived in 2 waves. Glass softened or broke. Flames pressed against the north wall and stripped pieces from the stone surface. Part of the roof covering burned. The men moved the narrow hose from one threatened point to another, wetting shutters and attacking embers before they could settle into the building. Inside the vaults sat gold and silver valued at about $300 million. Outside, more than half the city's population was looking for a place to sleep. The metal could not drink, burn, or carry a mattress. Yet banks had collapsed or closed, the sub-treasury had been destroyed, and rebuilding would depend on whether money could begin moving again. The Mint survived. It became vault, clearinghouse, relief treasury, and temporary office space for financial institutions that no longer possessed offices of their own. Telegraphic transfers allowed roughly $40 million to be distributed through the building from funds elsewhere in the country. At street level, supply stations delivered water from the same artesian well to thousands of people carrying cans, bottles, and buckets. That distribution did not settle who could rebuild. Across the ruined city, approximately 100,000 insurance claims accumulated. Each required someone to decide whether a wall had fallen from the earthquake or whether fire had destroyed it afterward. The distinction could determine whether a policy paid anything. Insured losses were estimated at $235 million, but only about $180 million reached claimants. The missing portion became unpaid lumber, absent rooms, and lots sold by owners who could not wait. At least 12 American insurers failed, along with companies in Europe. Others paid only part of what policyholders claimed. The disaster had erased buildings, but it had not erased mortgages, property boundaries, or the unequal ability to borrow. Rebuilding redistributed contracts, tenants, and ownership across land whose street addresses remained on city maps. In Chinatown, that redistribution was briefly proposed in literal form. The neighborhood had burned, and officials considered moving its residents to Hunters Point so that the old site near the commercial center could be redeveloped. Chinese refugees were placed in segregated camps, eventually at a cold, exposed edge of the Presidio near Fort Point. Chinese merchants and community organizations resisted. Representatives of the Chinese government informed California officials that the consulate would be rebuilt in the old neighborhood. City leaders also recognized what removal would cost in taxes and Pacific trade. The relocation plan failed. Chinatown rose again on the same ground others had hoped to acquire from its ashes. 9 years later, the Panama Pacific International Exposition covered 635 acres beside the bay, with broad avenues, exhibition halls, electrical displays, and temporary palaces. More than 18 million visitors passed through its gates. The city could once again sell land, movement, machinery, and an arranged view of itself. But the object that completes the story stood several miles away, behind the Mint's heavy walls. News of gold had once emptied San Francisco by sending men toward the mountains. In 1906, gold and silver remained locked inside the city, while fire moved around them. Their survival depended on a steam pump, 70 feet of hose, and water drawn from beneath a stone courtyard. At the center of that courtyard stood the well's worn rim. Far below it, the water was dark and still.